My name is Tammy Smith, and I'm Senior Advisor within the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund situated in the PBSO, and I'll be moderating today's event. I'm joined from the PBSO by my colleagues, Shazat Suleiman, who is a PBSO's Gender Advisor, as well as Nagina Khaitova, who is PBF's Knowledge Management Officer and, to be honest, the prime mover behind this review. The thematic review that we're launching today is part of a longstanding policy on the part of PBSO to consolidate knowledge about recurrent themes and organizational commitments related to the UN's peacebuilding work. In its current strategic plan, the PBF is committed to conducting 2 of these reviews per year. Our second theme for 2021 is a review on local peacebuilding efforts, with a particular emphasis on the role young people play within these initiatives. We'll publish this review in early 2022, so please keep your eyes open for that launch event, and that we hope that you'll be able to join as well. The thematic review on gender responsive peacebuilding was conducted as a follow-up to an earlier review in 2014. At PBF, we saw this as a good way to see how far we've traveled since then, and also to capture good practices, but to also note emergent or new challenges that need to be addressed in order to remain relevant in our support to gender responsive peacebuilding initiatives throughout the globe. Little could we have anticipated just how important that last consideration would be, but the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us all to adapt our approaches and to be alert for unforeseen ways in which the health crisis may be exacerbating or triggering new challenges. These findings were enriched by a series of consultations with local peacebuilders in Guatemala, Mali, Niger, South Sudan, Somalia, and Sri Lanka, and we're fortunate to have a number of partners from these consultations joining us today. We see today's event as an opportunity to look forward to see how various actors can apply the findings and recommendations of the review in their own work. The agenda today will begin with a short video presentation that animates some of the report's key findings. After that, we will hear from representatives of key stakeholder groups who will respond to questions about the opportunities or barriers they see in taking forward the review's recommendations. We have reserved time as well for you, our audience members, to share your questions. And so, without taking up further time, it's with great pleasure and thanks that I introduce our panelists for today's launch. From the member state or donor group, we have Sofia Armansky. Sofia has served as the deputy head of the Division for Stabilization and Crisis Prevention in the German Federal Foreign Office since July 2020. She previously served as a secondee to the World Bank Group in the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence section, as desk officer in the Sahel Division and the Task Force Afghanistan-Pakistan in Berlin, as well as head of the economic section at the German Embassy in Abuja, Nigeria. Her academic background is in public policy, economics, and history. From the UN group, we have Adriana Quiñones, the country representative for UN Women in Guatemala. Prior to this role, Adriana was regional advisor on the Elimination of Violence Against Women initiative at UN Women in Latin America and the Caribbean. Earlier, she served as the manager of the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women and worked as technical advisor for the fund for integration of gender equality at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. Adriana holds a master's degree in international peace studies from the University of Notre Dame, as well as an MA in international relations from Johns Hopkins University. We're also thankful to have with us representatives from local organizations, including Josephine Chandrio-Drama, who is the director of Steward Women, a women-led organization in South Sudan. Josephine is a 2013-2014 award recipient of the Women, Peace and Security Fellowship for African Women. She is a strong advocate of women's rights with over 10 years experience on the provision of access to justice for women and girls in South Sudan, during which time she has supported the prosecution of the first child marriage case in South Sudan. Josephine is a champion of the Maputo Protocol in South Sudan, having mobilized 40 local CSOs to amplify the campaign towards the ratification of the Women's Rights Protocol. She is the current chair of the Rule of Law Technical Reference Group of the National GBV subcluster in South Sudan. And from Sri Lanka, we are joined by Shyamala Gomez, the Executive Director for the Center of Equality and Justice in Sri Lanka. Shyamala is a human rights lawyer by training and has over 25 years experience as an academic, a researcher, and an activist. She has an LLB from the University of Colombo and a master's in law from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She's published in the areas of violence against women, masculinities, sexual violence and conflict, migrant workers' rights, women's land rights, reproductive rights, transitional justice, and on women, peace, and security. So we have a very distinguished panel today, but before hearing from them, as noted, please join us for a brief video that summarizes the key findings from the thematic review. Nagina, over to you.
The 2021 Thematic Review on Gender-Responsive Peacebuilding, commissioned by the UN Peacebuilding Support Office in partnership with the German Federal Foreign Office and UN Women, was prepared in the context of the 20th anniversary of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 that has been appended by an unprecedented health crisis. It maps good practices, gaps, challenges, emerging trends, and priorities for action in gender-responsive peacebuilding, and is informed by primary research in Guatemala, Mali, Niger, South Sudan, Somalia, and Sri Lanka. The review found that since 2014, the Secretary-General's Peacebuilding Fund has made impressive gains in terms of strengthening its systems to support gender-responsive peacebuilding. PBF has developed one of the most rigorous sets of requirements to gauge each project's contribution to gender equality and women's empowerment in the whole UN system. Additionally, the PBF has become a leader from within the UN system in setting, meeting, and exceeding ambitious goals related to investments into gender-responsive peacebuilding. The Secretary-General's 7-point action plan, which commits UN entities to allocate at least 15% of resources to this effort, has been difficult for many to achieve. The PBF first met this target in 2015, and even more importantly, the fund did not see 15% as the ceiling, but as the floor, so it raised its own internal target to 30%, a goal it has met or exceeded since 2017. This performance has encouraged bold target setting by others in the UN system. Despite these accomplishments, however, there are a few areas where the PBF and other actors, donors, policymakers, fund applicants, and recipients can further strengthen their efforts. First, the experience of the pandemic has placed into sharp relief pre-existing inequalities or institutional weaknesses. In some places, lockdown and other control measures have had the effect, intentional or not, of stifling civil society. Such challenges can easily transform into grievances that can destabilize communities, regions, and states. This thematic review urges member states to take a holistic approach to their responses to the pandemic within the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans. There is a need to reassess existing strategies to ensure they are appropriate to the current situation. The review also urges to appreciate that social groups, be it gender, ethnic, religious, are not homogeneous, recognizing the compounded effects of different vulnerabilities as well as strength of various identity groups, or in other words, taking an intersectional approach is key for gender-responsive peacebuilding. The review further urges international actors to ensure adequate levels of funding to gender-responsive peacebuilding, even amidst competing pandemic priorities. An area of the Women, Peace and Security agenda that remains chronically underfunded is direct bilateral aid to women's organizations in fragile and conflict-affected states. OECD data indicates that between 2016 and 2017, only 1% of all gender-focused funding went to local women's organizations. Between 2017 and 2018, this rate declined even further to only 0.39%. The Thematic review encourages donors to look for ways to make longer-term, flexible funding directly available to women's grassroots peacebuilding organizations, including through institutional and capacity building support, so that women's organizations are able to continue operating, meeting increasing demands of their communities. Finally, in order to better assess the progress on gender-responsive peacebuilding and generate greater buy-in and increased financial commitments, the review calls upon all peacebuilding practitioners to enhance efforts in developing rigorous theories of change that aim to explore the underlying assumptions about gendered causes of violence, as well as women's and men's distinct experiences of conflict or peace. It is crucial to also reimagine better articulated results and indicator frameworks. Currently, within the Women, Peace and Security agenda, there appears to be a near singular focus on women's participation in peacebuilding. While getting women to the table is a necessary first step, the review highlights that what happens once they are there needs more attention to ensure that women's participation is not just symbolic or tokenistic. As the UN Secretary-General notes, the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic presents the global community with a chance to save lives, protect societies, and recover better.
Everything we do during and after this crisis must be with a strong focus on building more equal, inclusive and sustainable economies and societies that are more resilient in the face of pandemics, climate change, and the many other global challenges we face. What the world needs now is solidarity. With solidarity, we can defeat the virus and build a better world.
It is our hope that this thematic review helps renew and strengthen the global commitment to gender-responsive peacebuilding at a time when there is an urgent need for transformation. For more findings and recommendations from PBSO's thematic review on gender-responsive peacebuilding, please visit www.un.org/peacebuilding.
So we hope that you enjoyed the video, and we also hope that you'll download the report or the review. We also want to note that the video was done also with support of UN online volunteers. So, turning to our panelists, I would like to ask them to keep the responses as succinct as possible since, as I noted, we're eager to also include questions and views from our audience members. And audience members, please type any points or questions that you would like to raise in the chat. We'll be moderating that throughout and noting your questions after our panelists have had a chance to respond to the first set of questions. So I'll begin, and our first question is for you, Sophia. Sophia, some of the main recommendations for donors coming out of this thematic review call for increasing financing of the WPS agenda, especially in light of COVID, and for supporting initiatives that place gender equality and grassroots engagement at the center of their strategies. In that regard, the review notes that in the face of overstretched resources, there is a need for donors to look carefully at how WPS funding is allocated, also making sure that long-term flexible funding is directly available to women's grassroots organizations despite competing priorities. This includes recognizing changing social, economic, and political environments created by the pandemic, which can affect future drivers of conflict. Sophia, can you speak to what this means for Germany? How can donors like Germany enhance support to grassroots women's peacebuilding organizations who have not only been on the front lines of the COVID-19 response, but also are working to address its consequences, including increased rates of SGBV? Sophia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tammy, for this excellent questions, and hello to everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be on this great panel with such inspiring women from all over the world. It's a great honor to speak to you today. I would like to touch on basically 3 points. The first is offer a few reflections on the changing dynamics with the COVID pandemic in peace-building context, although you probably have much more to say about that. Second, I want to describe very briefly how we have tried to respond and are trying to respond also to some of the recommendations from the review. And third, perhaps offer a few ideas on where does this take us, where does this leave us for the future steps in our work. So first, on the current situation, the timing, of course, of this review is very, very strategic. We are not yet in a post-pandemic phase, quite the contrary, right? Most countries are still facing a third, fourth, fifth wave of infections. And now we have a few new mutation even that has just appeared a few days ago. So in a way, I guess we have to accept that the pandemic has become the new normal for us, also in peace-building contexts, while we are still trying to adapt. So it's really timely to take stock, ask what we have learned, especially with regard to peace-building. It's pretty clear that while the pandemic affects us all, it does affect us differently. Our coping resources vary greatly across contexts, whether that is access to vaccines, booster shots, critical medical care, but also employment, financial aid, social safety nets, mental health support, to name just a few elements. And in fact, the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities at the individual and community level, which is also reflected in the review. Access to basic services beyond healthcare, such as protection, importantly, from sexual and gender-based violence, are more strained than ever. Women have borne the brunt, whether that is by carrying the double or even triple burden in the workplace and at home, or by paying with their health and lives as a result of aggravated forms of violence. For those already living in conflict zones pre-pandemic, the impact has been even more pronounced. In fact, the pandemic hasn't slowed down armed conflict, quite the contrary. According to the latest data, 2020 was the most violent year since 1945, both in terms of quantity and intensity of armed violence. So it is this context in which women peacebuilders all over the world have continued to labor and work and fight and lead on the front lines, trying to build dialogue, also cross lines, mediating between conflict actors, and striving to lay the foundations for peace while they themselves are battling violence. They deserve our unfettered support, these women all over the world and the groups that they're working in. So what have we done, or what are we trying to do as a donor? We are trying to look comprehensively at the local level, the regional level, and the global level. So perhaps let's start with the local. We try to support local women's organizations as directly as possible and support networking among civil society actors. So for instance, in South Sudan, we support local women's organizations to address SGBV as an obstacle for peace and in order to enhance the participation of women in peace-building processes. On a regional level, we very much believe in the power of networks across countries and sharing of lessons learned. So, for instance, we support the African Women Leaders Network, which was founded in 2017, to create an Africa-wide structure for women's participation in political and development processes. Another example is the Latin American Network on Women, Peace and Security from a feminist perspective, which is a very young alliance, as it brings together local leaders, young women, indigenous and rural women, to really invest in the power of the young. Now, finally, the global level, also mentioned in the thematic review, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which is a huge step forward in more systematic and reliable funding for women's organizations all across the world. We have engaged in this fund from the very beginning and are now the largest bilateral donor of the fund, with about 10 million euro contribution this year. And we've also supported a new rapid response window as a response to the situation in Afghanistan. Perhaps that's something to discuss later on during the webinar. And perhaps finally, a little bit more inward looking, we are also looking at our own ministry here, the Federal Foreign Office, where we still have quite an underrepresentation of women, of female officers who lend their support to peace building processes. And that's also, of course, a structural factor if we want to raise women's voices in peace building processes. To conclude, I'm concluding in a moment. Where does this leave us? It's absolutely crucial that we keep testing which approaches are most effective and efficient. In order to learn and improve, we need to measure the right things. For instance, how can we capture changes in power relations? That's what's driving or hampering peace processes. And how do we bring this systematically into our approaches? So we need to look at also need to break the glass ceiling when it comes to women negotiators in peace processes, and we have to become better. Also in the UN itself, we have a number of SRSGs and DSRSGs. They have increased the female numbers under the excellent leadership of the UN Secretary General, but we still have some way to go to appoint women special envoys, for example, to bring female voices to peace processes. Lastly, my last sentence, we are about to have the first female foreign minister here in Germany to be sworn in next week. And we are looking forward to a new emphasis on a new feminist foreign policy also from Germany. So stay tuned.
Thanks very much for those sort of insightful comments from donor perspective, and congratulations to Germany on what we hope will be a new feminist foreign policy. Our next question is for you, Adriana. The Peacebuilding Fund, we know, was established as a mechanism to primarily support UN agencies, funds, and programs in their efforts to prevent conflict and sustain peace. All PBF fund recipients, of course, work with national and local implementing partners, many of which are women's organizations. As part of this thematic review, many CSO interviewee respondents from smaller women's organizations recalled positive examples of how working in coalitions assisted them in improving managerial systems and skills. They also highlighted, however, the need for more sustained support in areas such as financial management, grant writing, and monitoring and evaluation. So the review calls all PBF fund recipients who partner with local community-based organizations to routinely emphasize institutional capacity development, and especially to track progress against capacity building targets that should be established at the project design stage. So the question is, Adriana, can you share any practical examples from UN Women's efforts to work with local partners on capacity building? Which other agencies might replicate in order for women's CSOs to be able to harness full advantages of partnering with UN entities? How can the findings from the review be leveraged to promote and expand this work? Adriana?
Thank you very much. I would like to first start with a little bit of context in terms of only in each country situation can we know and understand how change happens and what levers need to be leveraged. So in Guatemala, there has been support from the Peacebuilding Fund for at least 8 to 10 years, which has enabled UN Women to build bridges, to build trust, and to now have scalable results, not only at country, but at global level. So we have to work at the individual, at the organizational, in the alliances, and with the institutions. An example of this is the Sepulsarco case, a unique case of transitional justice where military men who committed sexual violence as part of the armed conflict have been sentenced, and 15 grandmothers, indigenous women, monolingual, who have fought for more than 20 years for justice, have received the only sentence by a domestic tribunal with 18 measures of reparation. So UN Women has accompanied actions both by women's organizations, the grandmothers who have always been leading the process to break the silence, to achieve justice, but now to monitor and ensure compliance with this transformative sentence. The work has been done within the local, departmental, national, within interinstitutional agreements for accountability. The abuelas have always been leaders of the whole process. And I will say that these pictures that you're seeing is to give you a flavor of the work that has been done. And it's work, again, with many partners, looking at what are the structures and what are the results, because we want to make sure that women's groups are successful, that the survivors are successful, and that institutions are successful. And it has been the support of the Peacebuilding Fund that has enabled us to tell this story. So to give you a few more of the scaling up of the achievements have always been in the hands of the grandmothers through their leadership. There's a judiciary policy on dignified and transformative reparation now in the justice system, a complete chapter on survivors' rights, including the right to actively participate in all stages of the judicial process, and to transformative reparation included in the General Prosecutor's guidelines on investigation and strategic prosecution of femicide and other forms of violence against women. The design of an index on women's access to justice and transformative reparation with measures, which measures the situation, conditions of women to have increased accountability, and the support provided to women's organizations to strengthen their digital protection mechanisms, to adapt a results-based approach in their programming. And for example, ECAP, one of our key partners, redesigned its whole strategic plan, and with support to establish rural-urban partnerships and cross-fertilization and strategic litigation of conflict and post-conflict related sexual violence. This involves indigenous women leading various paradigmatic cases in Guatemala and the abuelas. It has been a privilege to share the leadership of the Peacebuilding funded programs in Guatemala, hand by hand with the leader of the Abuelas of the Sepulsarco, Doña Demesia Yat. And it has been really interesting to see how placing the leadership on the Abuelas, on the survivors themselves, has enabled us to see a broader picture of where our support as UN Women and other UN organizations can be really used to the benefit and the success of what women have planned out as justice, of what women understand as reparation. And this is truly transformative. We had Demesia Yat in 2019 at the Security Council. So she's now an icon of these struggles, but it has also provided protection. These are all human rights defenders. And when we're all working together to ensure their success, their achievements can be sustained and the transformation can be protected. As you know, we are in a context of global reversal on women's human rights, and the achievements that have taken generations must be protected and enhanced by our efforts. So I want to make a very special mention. to the Peacebuilding Fund for having the strategic view of supporting this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and inspiring work in Guatemala. Next, we have a question for Josephine. So Josephine, research indicates that peace-building agreements, I just want to make sure my mic is on, sorry. Research indicates that peace agreements are more likely to include specific gender provisions if women are present at the negotiation table. Likewise, electoral gender quotas have been associated with greater legislative attention directed towards the interests and priority of women. A challenge mentioned by some of the respondents for the thematic review, however, is to ensure that women's participation is not just symbolic or tokenistic. Overall, I think we have to say the peace-building sector remains unhelpfully concerned with numbers, with sort of counting women. While getting women to the table certainly is a necessary first step, the review highlights that what happens once they're at the table, once they are there, needs more attention to avoid merely symbolic or tokenistic participation by women. So Josephine, from your experience with steward women in South Sudan, what are some of the specific barriers women face to achieve real authority and decision-making power when they are brought to the table? How can these challenges be addressed so that gender-responsive peace building doesn't just end when women are included and that their substantive engagement is supported? Josephine?
Thank you, our host, fellow panelists, and then participants. I'm very honored to be a speaker during this thematic review launch. And my intervention today is going to focus on two key barriers. One barrier women face when they are brought to the peace table is the display of unequal power dynamics, which remains visible, and the needs of minority groups may also not be reflected. Women's concerns are usually considered to be secondary to discussions taking place at the table. The recommendations also put forward by women at the table may not necessarily be included in the broader text of peace. By the time women and other minority groups are accepted at the table, they would have fought their way to reach there. A typical example was the South Sudan peace negotiations. That is why it is crucial to maintain the hard-won space for women in all their diversity, so as to allow women to participate in the already male-dominated realm of peace and security. By way of recommendation, I would therefore emphasize on the importance of gender balancing of men and women at the table to yield even stronger outcomes for peace building. This balancing should be purposely done through the adoption of a more sophisticated approach that pays attention to the power women hold, how their participation changes gender practices, the impact of gender expertise and women-led civil society advocacy, and how these elements interact with the wider conflict dynamics. My second issue that I want to talk about is the issue of funding, which is a typical barrier. It is one thing to admit women at the table, and it's another for women to sustain their game at the table as long as it takes. For instance, between 2012 and 2014, Steward Women, the organization that I work for, received funding to implement access to justice interventions. As you all recall, by 15th December 2013, South Sudan became a war zone. This meant that the Access to Justice project could no longer be implemented as planned. But The donor allowed us to use only $1,000 to support the peace negotiations taking place in Addis Ababa. This support could hardly facilitate a return flight for an individual woman to travel to Addis Ababa. Hence, the decline in funding gap between 2017 and 2018, which was 0.39%, as noted by the thematic review findings, especially for South Sudan, this meant that less women participation at the table, and that and the women that bravely made it to the table could also be those that are coming from the political wing and not from the CSO, because the lack of funding or the sustainability of funding would not be available for the CSO NGO. So my recommendation in this area is that it is therefore critical that all donors address these persistent funding gaps, finance the women, peace and security agenda in a moment of extraordinary crisis by scaling up direct funding to grassroots women organizations in fragile and conflict-affected states, and supporting those peace-building initiatives that place gender equality and grassroots engagement at the center of their strategies. So we would like donors to also be more flexible to allocate sustainable funding to women sitting at the table, not just to the men alone. These are my interventions. Over to you.
Thank you so much for these incredibly insightful, but frankly, extremely frustrating to hear barriers and challenges, but really, I think, important for everyone to be reminded of these, I think, very avoidable challenges. So finally, our fourth question, Shyamala, is to you. The thematic review indicates that the term gender is often used as a placeholder for women. Gender essentialism remains a persistent challenge in WPS discourse. Women are still often treated as a homogeneous group with similar experiences and needs. The assumption of women's sameness repeats problematic gender binaries and fails to account for the fact that gender is often only one axis of exclusion. Essentialist discourse can then also lead to essentialist action and contribute to the design of interventions that do not meet the needs of different segments of society, including those of minority groups. So the question is, how does the Center for Equality and Justice in Sri Lanka provide support to diverse groups of women, recognizing that they have different experiences and needs? And how do you think an intersectional approach can be taken at the WPS policy level? Shyamala?
Hi, thank you, Tammy. I do hope that you can hear me. Greetings from the Gambia, where I have come to, as part of the Commonwealth Observer Group, to monitor to observe the presidential elections that take place on December 4th. I do hope you can hear me. I'm sorry, the internet connection is really bad. Let me try and get through my presentation. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I appreciate the effort because CEJ, Center for Equality and Justice, has been fortunate enough to be given funding from the UNPBF, where when we implemented a very large project on sexual bribery or sexual exploitation among war-affected women. So thank you to UNPBF. In terms of just a little bit about CEJ, we are an organization that began in 2017, and we work mainly with war-affected women. And by war-affected women, I mean the Sinhalese, the Tamil, and the Muslim women that have been directly and indirectly impacted by the war, the 26-year war in Sri Lanka. In terms of the work that we do, we work on raising awareness and building capacity of diverse stakeholders. We also provide, we do advocacy for law and policy reforms, and we also, our main data pool is our research, the research that we do at ground level. So that is just a little bit of introduction to CAJ's work. Analytics of women, I think this is the crux of our work. The fact being that we work with diverse communities, we work with diverse ethnic groups, and the fact that it's really important to work with these women in a way that understands their challenges, the different challenges that they have. But of course, recognizing that sometimes challenges are the same, which is also something quite that there are certain challenges that are the same among all three different majority communities. But I would like to also say that recognizing the issue of gender, we also work with the LGBTIQ community. For example, currently we're doing some research on sexual bribery and the fact that certain members of the LGBTIQ community have been asked for sexual bribes or sexual favors when trying to access public services. So this is one thing that we are very mindful of, and we make sure that we include gender minority ground level realities are taken into account. And I think this is something that CJ from the start has been emphasizing upon, the fact that we need to recognize from district to district. Sometimes even within the same district, you have different ethnic groups living there, and the experiences differ based on which ethnic group they belong to. Let me give you some examples. For example, Sinhalese women living in the border villages that border the conflict areas include women, Sinhalese and Muslim community. Experience of war and conflict differed. For example, in terms of their land rights, in terms of how they were displaced, where they were displaced to, who took over, for example, their lands, their access to services. All of these different facets of their lives were different based on the ethnic group that they belong to. Similarly, CEJ has done research on early cohabitation or child marriage among Sinhalese and Tamil girls in the border villages again. Here too, we have found that, and it's a first time study really on the prevalence of early cohabitation in the war-affected districts. And what you find is that the experiences differ, and the fact that you need to take this into consideration when we ask policymakers and lawmakers to in looking at law reform and policy reform in these areas. So that's another example. Similarly, I think it's about one example I can give you is a language barrier, because there are Tamil speaking women, that is the Muslim women and the Sinhalese women, the Tamil Muslim and the Tamil women that speak Tamil. And there too, you have a situation where these women, when they, for example, access the courts or access justice, these sort of experiences are taken into account in the way in which we design our interventions. Similarly, and I hope you can hear me, I know I have a little bit more time, but I'd like to just bring onto the table the fact that we work on reparations for women. And here too, we are extremely insistent that our message is that reparations are required from all three communities. This is a strategic move, and I think it's really important that when we work with government, we make sure that all three communities are represented in our call for reparations from the Office for Reparations. Similarly, sexual violence in conflict, the women and the gender minorities that have experienced CRSV also differs based on their ethnic group. So these are some of the, the important sort of areas that we work in, and where we recognize the fact that intersectionality is key in understanding the experiences of different types of women. Just to go into a second question, intersectional approach can be taken at WPS policy level. What I really like to emphasize is the fact that policymakers need to be aware of the ground realities. And this can only be done by actually talking to CSOs and grassroots communities that work on the ground to design a WPS policy. These are some of the examples I'd like to take and to take them. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry, you were beginning to break up quite a bit at the end, but we take overall the point that we, as donors, as funders, as other kinds of actors in this environment, need to be speaking with the women, the conflict affected women, the women who we are engaging with, and hearing from them and from their communities. I think your illustrations around what intersectionality looks like on the ground were also incredibly important for everyone to hear. We have a little bit more than 10 minutes left, and we would like to, as we said at the very beginning, invite any questions from our audience members, and we don't see any questions right now in the chat. So maybe just to sort of get us started, and as I maybe throw out this question, it'll be to all of our panelists to sort of jump in. So if I can ask you to turn on your cameras, unless of course you're experiencing some bandwidth issues. And so I'll throw out a question. So I guess the best way to put it is, what about the men? The review highlights that the WPS agenda has a near singular focus on women. But we know that considering only half the population will be limiting to advancing across all different levels of results. So to our panelists, how can the role of men be considered in gender responsive peacebuilding efforts? Anyone willing to take that on?
Yes, I can start.
Yeah. Thank you.
So it's very important for us in our approach and in our theory of change and looking at all the levels of transformation to make sure that we are investing in women so that they can be negotiating transformations with men. So as you know, the majority of men are in decision-making positions. They are the holders of the budgets. They make the decisions. And so it's very important that women are positioned in a space to be also decision makers along with men. What we have seen in Guatemala now is that very important leaders of the traditional authorities of indigenous peoples, who are traditionally men, have joined in our projects, have been building new alliances with commitments, for example, for the local indigenous authorities to increase the participation of women in their councils, because they now see the advantage of working alongside with women. So I think it has been a strategy of positioning women and supporting women to be in a place where they can truly negotiate. And that's where the transformations begin. We have also integrated this work within the authorities of the judicial system at all levels and had cross-regional, interinstitutional dialogues with indigenous authorities and the highest authorities in the judicial branch. And so the learning, the cross-fertilization, the understanding of where each segment is coming from, it's what's really supporting and creating a synergy around it. We also have included within the workshops and within the training, reflections on, for example, the issues of care, how much women are invested in care work that's invisible, unaccounted for, and how we need to transform these visions, including in the case of Guatemala, bringing back notions of community level collaboration, how we are all integrated to nature, to taking care of the planet, and how that involves the collaboration of men and women for the benefit of the community. There's also, of course, always conversations around the issues of violence against women and how impunity is what what really feeds this continuum of violence in so many different forms. So there's always a reflection in terms of how supporting access to justice, public policies for transformative reparation are efforts to be joined by men also at every level, at the community, within the indigenous local authorities, within the local governments, which has been a very strong effort of all the peace building projects, and at the national level. So we are demonstrating how change is happening at different levels. We cannot work only on policy, we cannot work only at community level, but we have to have a chain where this transformation feeds one level to the other and vice versa.
Thanks so much. I'm not seeing any additional hands raised for this particular question. And so we actually have one question in the chat, comes from Carolina Futuro. And I will maybe, there's been a little bit of an exchange asking for clarification. So let me sort of just ask the question, which is, what is the role of infrastructure in gender responsive peace building processes? And I had asked whether it is for infrastructures of peace or for like sort of basic services. And her response was that it could be both, and that the root of the question was coming from sort of already sort of consolidated notions of the role of infrastructure in child protection, for example, in safe school concepts and similar. So, and I see she sort of added another, gender inclusive infrastructure concepts and design have proven to be more sustainable for community engagement in the experience of her organization, in development, in WASH, in education, projects in fragile states. But she was wondering if there's an opinion from experience in peace building. So the question, I guess, would be the sort of gender inclusivity within infrastructure as it relates to specifically peace building work. And let me just close the chat so I can see everybody. I'm not sure if anyone has any anything to add. I can actually sort of comment about it. One example that I know of, actually from Kyrgyzstan, where the Peace Building Fund was supporting a project to address gaps of basic services and extension of sort of services to informal settlements outside of the capital of Bishkek. And overall, the absence of these services was driving a lot of grievance and mistrust between these growing communities that were outside of any kind of access to services and the institutions of the state. And the concern was also that this would potentially generate either backlash against the state or, in the worst cases, sort of recruitment by more violent groups. And we came in recognizing that women play a particular role in these communities, either in trying to ensure that their children are gaining access to education, in sort of maintaining sort of healthcare and in accessing healthcare, in having sort of safe access to and from their community via appropriate roads. We worked through women's organizations, formal and informal, in and around these settlements in Bishkek to connect them with some services and local grants that the municipality was offering that they had no idea how to access. They didn't know that these things existed. And so by trying to sort of be the connecting points between the really important and dynamic work that was already happening among formal and informal associations of women on the ground together, to put them sort of in better touch with the formal institutions so that they can begin to sort of close that distance and actually hold the state accountable for the access to the basic services that they needed. And we saw actually that the result was not just that the role of like the women and women's empowerment in those cases was amplified, but in so doing, they also ensured greater access to those services, which had ultimately the effect that I think we were hoping to generate from the peace building side of raising people's confidence in the state institutions and bringing them closer into the sort of state society relationship and trying to repair that. So that's one example that I know of from our work. And I see that there's a hand raised. Is it Josephine?
Yes, it's me. So I just also wanted to share an example of the infrastructure for children in peace building. One work that we've done at the grassroots is where we provide safe spaces for women to engage, like the women and girls friendly spaces at grassroots level. These women usually come with their children. So that means if we keep the women with their children in the safe space, the women will not concentrate on the work that they want to do, or they won't concentrate on the engagements. So we have to put another space for their children just next to the space for the women, so that the children can play, the children can engage each other, the children can interact with each other in their small space. So that is the infrastructure that we put forward to ensure that women have their space to engage, as well as their children also have an opportunity to engage themselves. And then if we have other partners who want to engage with the children, they would actually come and engage with these children there as we engage with the women, because our role is to engage with women and girls and not children. Yeah, so that is what we do. Of course, we take into account the child protection policies, that children are not marginalized in the space in which they are in. So someone has to be watching them so that they do not hurt each other or they do not get hurt. Yeah, that is my addition.
Thank you so much. I see that we're also running out of time. So let me, by way of wrapping up, also address a comment or a question from our colleague from Japan. So the question from the Japanese mission to the UN was, how are we as PBF going to take forward these recommendations? What comes next for this gender responsive peace building thematic review? So, I mean, we are delighted that the review highlights the ways in which some of the systems that we've put in place have really helped us advance on our work. We've been meeting and exceeding our already sort of higher target of at least 30%. We will maintain that commitment and keep striving to hit more like 40% of our resources being dedicated to gender equality and women's empowerment. We, however, will be taking some of the other more critical observations around how we can be doing better within gender responsive conflict analysis that forms the basis for the projects that we're funding, for how we can be doing better on really ensuring that the commitments that are made in the project stage, the proposal stage, are actually followed through within implementation. And so we're going to be revising and updating our guidance note on gender responsive peace building that will then help us, I think, better track our commitments to gender equality and women's empowerment. So those are some of the sort of high level things that we're going to be doing. We will also be looking at ways in our next 2022 Gender Promotion Initiative, which is an annual call for proposals, to see how we can embed some of the recommendations from this report into the next call for proposals. So with that, it's a way of saying stay tuned. And as I noted earlier, we will have a second thematic review on local peace building initiatives and their correspondence to other higher level efforts around peace building that will be coming out and being launched in early 2022. We hope that you'll join us for our launch events for that as well. And before I wrap up, just to say thank you so much to our panelists for responding from your own organizational point of view for how you see either barriers or opportunities for taking forward some of the recommendations. Thank you so much. And this has been recorded and will be available on social media to share with people who may not have been able to participate today, or to go back and reflect on some of the things that were raised by our important panel member interventions. So thank you on behalf of PBSO, and have a good day. Bye.